They found her on the third day after Christmas, in a shepherd's hut high in the Yorkshire moors, half frozen and delirious with fever. The girl, who had once been destined to become the next Duchess of Ashford, lay curled beneath tattered wool blankets, her fine silk gown torn and muddied beyond recognition. But what shocked the search party most was not her condition. It was the look in her eyes when they spoke the Duke's name. Not fear, not longing. Something far more dangerous, indifference. The scandal that had driven Miss Eleanor Ashford from the Duke's Christmas ball had been swift and merciless. But what no one yet knew was that her disappearance would unravel secrets that would shake the very foundations of English aristocracy. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. The winter of 1887 had arrived early at Ashford Hall, bringing with it a biting cold that seemed to seep through even the grandest of stone walls. Miss Eleanor Ashford stood at the tall window of her chambers, watching servants scurry across the courtyard below, their breath forming small clouds in the December air as they carried armloads of holly and ivy for the Christmas decorations. In 3 days' time, the most important ball of the season would take place within these walls, and Eleanor knew that her entire future hung upon its success. She was 22 years old, possessed of a keen mind and a quiet beauty that her mother insisted was sufficiently refined for the position. Her dark hair fell in waves that her lady's maid, Agnes, spent hours arranging each morning. Her grey eyes held an intelligence that had been carefully trained to mask itself behind demure glances and appropriate silences. Eleanor had been raised for one purpose alone: to secure an advantageous marriage that would restore her family's dwindling fortune and elevate their social standing. The Ashfords, though bearing a distinguished name, had fallen on difficult times. Eleanor's father, Sir Richard Ashford, had made a series of poor investments in railway ventures that had collapsed spectacularly, leaving the family estate mortgaged and their London townhouse closed for the season. Eleanor's mother, Lady Charlotte Ashford, had spent the past 3 years manoeuvring her daughter into the orbit of the most eligible bachelors in England, and at last her efforts had borne fruit. Lord Edmund Thornfield, heir to the Duke of Ashford, had expressed interest in making Eleanor his wife. The match was considered brilliant by everyone who knew of it. The Thornfields were among the wealthiest families in England, their ducal seat encompassing thousands of acres across Yorkshire and Derbyshire, with additional properties in London, Bath, and Scotland. Lord Edmund himself was 30 years old, educated at Oxford, and widely regarded as one of the season's greatest catches. He was tall, fair-haired, and moved through society with the assured grace of a man who had never known hardship or rejection. Eleanor had met him at a garden party in June, where he had singled her out for conversation, discussing poetry and music with what seemed like genuine interest. Their courtship had been swift and proper, conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones and within the bounds of strict propriety. He had called upon her family 3 times, taken her for drives in Hyde Park, and partnered with her at 2 balls. When he had formally asked Sir Richard for permission to court Eleanor with matrimonial intent, her father had nearly wept with relief. Yet, as Eleanor stood at her window, watching the preparations for the ball that would essentially serve as her engagement announcement, she felt a strange hollowness in her chest. She had tried to convince herself that the feeling was merely nervousness, the natural anxiety of a bride-to-be. But in her most honest moments, Eleanor acknowledged what troubled her. She did not love Lord Edmund Thornfield, and she suspected, though she hardly dared admit it even to herself, that he did not love her. Their conversations, though pleasant, remained curiously superficial. He spoke of hunting parties and political matters, but never asked about her thoughts on the novels she read or the watercolours she painted. When she had once ventured to discuss a lecture on social reform she had attended with her aunt, his eyes had glazed with polite disinterest, and he had swiftly changed the subject to the upcoming racing season. Eleanor had learned to smile, nod, and keep her more passionate opinions to herself. "Miss Eleanor, your mother wishes to see you in the drawing room," Agnes announced, appearing at the doorway with a curtsy. Eleanor turned from the window, smoothing the grey wool of her morning dress. "Thank you, Agnes. I'll come at once." The drawing room of Ashford Hall was a testament to faded grandeur. The silk wallpaper, once vibrant with pastoral scenes, had dulled to a soft cream, and the furniture, though elegant, showed signs of wear, carefully concealed by strategic placement of cushions and throws. Lady Charlotte sat ramrod straight in her favourite chair, a sheaf of papers spread before her on the mahogany table. "Eleanor, my dear, come sit. We must review the particulars for the ball." Her mother's voice held the brittle quality it had acquired over the past few years, a forced cheerfulness masking constant anxiety about finances and social position. Eleanor took her seat obediently, folding her hands in her lap. "The Duke and Duchess will be arriving tomorrow afternoon with Lord Edmund," Lady Charlotte continued, consulting her lists. "The Dowager Duchess has written to say she will attend as well, bringing Lord Edmund's cousin, Miss Charlotte Waverley. You remember Miss Waverley, don't you?" Eleanor did indeed remember Charlotte Waverley. She was Lord Edmund's distant cousin, a striking blonde with a sharp wit and sharper tongue, who had made her disdain for Eleanor perfectly clear at their previous meeting. Charlotte came from the wealthiest branch of the family and seemed to view Eleanor as an upstart interloper unworthy of the Thornfield name. "Yes, Mother, I remember her." The Duchess has indicated that she wishes to speak with you privately before the ball," Lady Charlotte said, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her nerves. "This is an excellent sign, Eleanor. She undoubtedly wishes to discuss the wedding arrangements. You must make the very best impression." "I shall endeavour to do so, Mother." "Your entire future depends upon this ball, Eleanor. Our family's future depends upon it." Lady Charlotte's facade cracked slightly, revealing the desperation beneath. "You must be perfect, absolutely perfect. The announcement of your engagement to Lord Edmund will restore everything we've lost. Everything." The weight of these expectations settled upon Eleanor's shoulders like a leaden cloak. She understood with perfect clarity what her mother meant. Marriage to Lord Edmund would bring a substantial marriage settlement, would clear her father's debts, would restore the Ashford family to their rightful place in society. To fail now, to disappoint her parents after they had invested so much hope in this match, was unthinkable. "I understand, Mother." That evening Eleanor dined alone in her room, claiming fatigue from the preparations. In truth, she needed solitude to steel herself for what lay ahead. She sat at her writing desk, a half-finished letter to her Aunt Margaret lying before her. Aunt Margaret was her father's sister, a widow who lived in the Lake District and who had always encouraged Eleanor's intellectual pursuits. She was the only person to whom Eleanor could write honestly about her doubts and fears. But tonight, Eleanor could not find the words to express the confusion that churned within her heart. Instead, she rose and moved to her bookshelf, selecting a worn volume of poetry. She opened it to a passage she had marked months ago, lines from Elizabeth Barrett Browning that had resonated deeply. "I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise." Eleanor closed the book slowly. Was this not what love should be? Free, pure, untainted by calculation or advantage? Yet here she was, preparing to pledge her life to a man she barely knew, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with duty and survival. She moved to the window once more, gazing out at the darkened Yorkshire landscape. Snow had begun to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the lamplight. In the distance, she could see the lights of the village, warm and golden against the winter darkness. Simple people lived there, she thought. People who married for love, who chose their own paths, who were not bound by the suffocating expectations of an ancient name and a crumbling fortune. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Agnes entered with a tea tray. "Miss Eleanor, I've brought you some chamomile. Your mother thought it might help you sleep." "Thank you, Agnes." Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully, warming her hands on its surface. "If I may say so, miss," Agnes ventured carefully, "you seem troubled. Are you quite well?" Eleanor looked at her maid, a young woman only a year older than herself, who had been in service at Ashford Hall since childhood. Agnes had married a footman the previous year in a simple ceremony at the village church, and Eleanor remembered the radiant happiness on her face that day. "Agnes, may I ask you something? When you married Thomas, were you certain it was right? Did you have no doubts at all?" Agnes smiled softly. "Oh, I had doubts, miss. Every bride does, I should think. But I knew it was right because when I thought of my life without him, everything seemed grey and empty. With him, even the hardest days seemed bearable because we'd faced them together. That's how I knew." Eleanor nodded slowly, unable to meet Agnes's eyes. When she thought of her life without Lord Edmund Thornfield, she felt nothing, no sense of loss, no emptiness, and that more than anything told her what she needed to know but could never ever acknowledge aloud. The next day brought a flurry of activity as the Duke's party arrived. Eleanor stood with her parents in the grand entrance hall, her heart beating rapidly beneath her sage-green visiting gown. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced their guests, and moments later the massive oak doors swung open. The Duke of Ashford entered first, an imposing man in his 60s with steel-grey hair and a bearing that commanded instant respect. Behind him came the Duchess, elegant in burgundy velvet, her sharp eyes immediately assessing every detail of the Ashfords' hall with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. Lord Edmund followed, looking every inch the perfect aristocrat in his travelling coat, his blue eyes finding Eleanor and offering her a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. But it was the final two figures who captured Eleanor's attention. The Dowager Duchess, Lord Edmund's grandmother, entered with the aid of an ivory cane, her white hair impeccably arranged beneath a fashionable hat. And beside her, radiant in travelling blues that perfectly complemented her blonde curls, was Miss Charlotte Waverley. Charlotte's eyes found Eleanor immediately, and something flickered in their depths, something cold and calculating that sent an inexplicable shiver down Eleanor's spine. The formal greetings were exchanged with all due ceremony, and the guests were shown to their rooms to refresh themselves before tea. Eleanor found herself in the drawing-room an hour later, seated beside Lord Edmund on the settee, while their families engaged in polite conversation around them. "You look well, Miss Ashford," Edmund said quietly, his tone pleasant but distant. "I trust the preparations for the ball have not overtaxed you." "Not at all, Lord Edmund. We are most honoured to host your family for Christmas." "Indeed. Mother is quite looking forward to the occasion. She has some matters she wishes to discuss with you privately." Eleanor's heart sank slightly at his tone. There was something perfunctory in his manner, as though he were reciting lines from a script rather than speaking to his intended bride. Across the room, Charlotte Waverley was holding court, entertaining the Duchess and Lady Charlotte with an amusing anecdote about a recent London ball. Her laughter rang out, clear and confident, and Eleanor noticed how Lord Edmund's attention seemed to drift toward his cousin, a slight smile playing at his lips as he listened to her story. As tea concluded and the guests dispersed to prepare for dinner, the Duchess approached Eleanor with a gracious smile. "Miss Ashford, would you be so kind as to join me in the library? I believe we have much to discuss." "Of course, Your Grace. It would be my pleasure." Eleanor followed the Duchess down the corridor to the library, her palms growing damp despite the chill in the air. This was the moment her mother had prepared her for, the moment when her future would be secured. But as she stepped into the library and saw the expression on the Duchess's face, courteous but cold, appraising but distant, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of premonition, a whisper of warning that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The night of the Christmas ball arrived, with a brilliance that seemed to mock Eleanor's growing sense of dread. Ashford Hall blazed with candlelight, every room decorated with garlands of evergreen, holly berries, and white roses forced to bloom in the conservatory. The ballroom, rarely opened in recent years, had been transformed into a winter wonderland, its crystal chandeliers casting dancing reflections across the polished floor where over 200 guests would soon gather. Eleanor stood in her chambers, allowing Agnes to fasten the final hooks of her gown. It was the finest dress she had ever owned, purchased by her mother specifically for this occasion at considerable expense. The fabric was ivory silk, overlaid with delicate lace, the bodice fitted to perfection, the skirts falling in elegant folds. Pearl combs held her dark hair in an elaborate arrangement, and a strand of pearls, a gift from Lord Edmund that had arrived that afternoon, encircled her throat. "You look beautiful, miss," Agnes whispered, her eyes shining with emotion, like a princess from a storybook. Eleanor stared at her reflection in the long mirror. She did look beautiful. The gown transformed her, lending her a grace and elegance that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. But as she gazed at her own grey eyes, she saw something she had been trying to ignore for weeks: fear. The conversation with the Duchess 2 days prior had been cordial, but strange. The Duchess had discussed wedding customs and family traditions, but there had been an odd quality to her questions, a probing nature that had made Eleanor uncomfortable. And more than once, the Duchess had made pointed references to family loyalty and knowing one's place, phrases that seemed to carry hidden meanings Eleanor could not quite decipher. "Miss Eleanor, your father is waiting to escort you downstairs," Agnes said gently. Eleanor took a deep breath, pressing one gloved hand against her stomach to quell the nervous flutter there. "Thank you, Agnes. I'm ready." The ballroom was already filled with guests when Eleanor descended the grand staircase on her father's arm. Heads turned as she entered, and she heard the whispered conversations, the approving murmurs. Lady Charlotte stood near the entrance, her face flushed with pride and relief as she watched her daughter make her entrance. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the night when Eleanor Ashford would be publicly acknowledged as the future bride of Lord Edmund Thornfield. The Duke and Duchess stood at the far end of the ballroom, receiving guests with regal formality. Lord Edmund stood beside his father, resplendent in evening dress, his fair hair gleaming in the candlelight. But Eleanor's attention was caught by the figure next to Edmund, Charlotte Waverley, stunning in a gown of deep crimson that clung to her figure in a way that was almost scandalous. She stood close to Edmund, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and when she laughed at something he said, she leaned in with an intimacy that made Eleanor's breath catch. "Come, my dear," Sir Richard murmured, guiding her forward. "Let us greet our guests of honour." The orchestra began to play as they crossed the ballroom, and Eleanor felt as though she were moving through a dream. Faces smiled at her from all sides, neighbours, distant relatives, members of society who had come to witness this important event. But there was something in their smiles that troubled her, a knowing quality that she could not understand. They reached the receiving line, and the Duke nodded gravely to Sir Richard before turning his attention to Eleanor. "Miss Ashford, you look charming this evening." "Thank you, Your Grace. You honour our house with your presence." The Duchess extended her hand, which Eleanor took and curtsied over. When she rose, she found the Duchess studying her with an expression that was difficult to read, not unkind precisely, but distant, almost pitying. "Such a lovely gown, my dear. One might almost think this were a wedding rather than a mere Christmas ball." The words landed with peculiar emphasis, and Eleanor felt a flush creep up her neck. Before she could respond, Lord Edmund stepped forward. "Miss Ashford, I hope you will honour me with the first dance." "Of course, Lord Edmund. I would be delighted." His hand was cool and impersonal as he led her onto the dance floor. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and they began to move through the familiar steps. Eleanor had danced with Edmund before, but tonight something was different. He held her correctly, maintained proper distance, but his attention seemed elsewhere. His eyes kept straying over her shoulder, and when she followed his gaze during a turn, she saw Charlotte Waverley watching them, a strange smile playing at her lips. "You seem distracted, Lord Edmund," Eleanor ventured, keeping her voice low. "Is something troubling you?" He looked down at her then, and for a moment she saw something in his expression. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. "Miss Ashford, there is something I must speak with you about. After this dance, perhaps we might step onto the terrace." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Of course. Is it about the announcement? Your father mentioned—" "Please, let us speak privately. Not here." The waltz concluded, and Edmund led her through the French doors onto the stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The December air was bitingly cold, and Eleanor shivered despite her evening gloves. Edmund did not offer his coat. "Miss Ashford, Eleanor, I hardly know how to begin." He turned away from her, staring out at the darkened landscape. "I have behaved dishonorably, and I must beg your understanding." Eleanor felt the world begin to tilt beneath her feet. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "The truth is that I cannot marry you." The words came quickly, as though he had rehearsed them. "I have made a terrible mistake in allowing this courtship to continue. My heart belongs to another." The shock hit Eleanor like a physical blow. For a moment she could not draw breath, could not think. "Another? But you. We have been courting for 6 months. Your father gave his blessing. The ball tonight is meant to announce our engagement. I know, and I am deeply sorry, but I cannot live a lie. I cannot bind myself to you when my affections lie elsewhere." He turned back to face her, and in the moonlight his handsome features looked tortured. "It is Charlotte. It has always been Charlotte. We have loved each other since childhood, but our families forbade the match because we are cousins. When I was forced to seek a suitable bride, I chose you because you seemed appropriate, biddable, unlikely to cause complications." The words stung worse than any slap. Appropriate? Biddable? I thought I could do my duty, marry suitably and forget Charlotte. But I cannot. These past weeks, having her near again, I have realized that I cannot sacrifice my happiness for social convention. Charlotte and I intend to marry, with or without our family's approval. Eleanor felt something break inside her. Not her heart, for she had never loved Edmund, but her pride, her sense of self-worth. "And you choose to tell me this now? Tonight in front of 200 guests who have come to celebrate our engagement? It is better you learn the truth now than after we are wed. Surely you can see that." "What I see," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage, "is a coward who has used me abominably. You have allowed me and my family to believe, to plan, to invest everything in a future that you had no intention of providing." "I am sorry," Edmund said stiffly, clearly offended by her characterization, "but I am offering you a mercy. You are free to return to the marriage market, to find a husband who can truly care for you. Is that not preferable to a loveless marriage?" Before Eleanor could respond, the French doors burst open. Charlotte Waverley stood there, backlit by the golden glow of the ballroom, her crimson gown making her look like an avenging angel, or a demon. "Edmund, darling, you've been gone so long. Have you told her?" Charlotte's voice dripped with false sympathy as she glided onto the terrace. "Charlotte, this is hardly the time." "Oh, but it is the perfect time." Charlotte moved to Edmund's side, slipping her arm through his with possessive intimacy. "You see, Miss Ashford, Edmund and I have been in love for years. Everyone who matters knows it. Did you truly think a baron's daughter with a bankrupt father could capture the heir to a dukedom? How deliciously naive." "Charlotte, that's enough," Edmund said, but his protest was weak. "Is it? The poor dear has a right to know the truth. Edmund only courted you because his father insisted he marry someone, anyone, to produce heirs. But love conquers all, doesn't it? We've decided to brave society's censure and marry despite being cousins. The church will grant a dispensation. Edmund's father is already arranging it. We depart for Scotland tomorrow morning." Eleanor stood frozen, the magnitude of the disaster washing over her. Not only had Edmund rejected her, but he had done so in favor of his cousin, and they had clearly been conducting an affair under her very nose. The humiliation was complete. "Does your family know?" Eleanor managed to ask, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. "They're being told right now," Charlotte said with evident satisfaction. "Edmund's father is making the announcement inside. I imagine your mother is having quite the reaction." As if summoned by Charlotte's words, a sound erupted from within the ballroom. A woman's cry, high and anguished. Lady Charlotte's voice, Eleanor realized with horror. She heard the sudden cessation of music, the rising babble of shocked voices. "My mother," Eleanor whispered. She pushed past Charlotte and Edmund, stumbling back into the ballroom. What she saw would be seared into her memory forever. In the center of the room, the Duke of Ashford stood with a raised hand, commanding attention. Lady Charlotte Ashford had collapsed into a chair, her face ashen, while Sir Richard stood beside her, looking as though he had aged 20 years in an instant. The 200 guests stood in clusters, whispering behind fans and gloved hands, their faces alive with scandal and speculation. The Duke's voice rang out clearly. "I apologize for the disruption to this festive evening. It is my duty to inform you that there will be no engagement announcement tonight. Lord Edmund and Miss Ashford have mutually agreed that they do not suit. I ask that you respect both families' privacy during this difficult time." The lie was thin and unconvincing. Already, Eleanor could see guests glancing toward the terrace, where Edmund and Charlotte had now appeared, standing together in a manner that left no doubt about their relationship. The whispers grew louder, more pointed. "Jilted for the cousin. The poor girl. How utterly mortifying. I always said the Ashfords were reaching above their station. Bankrupt and rejected. The family is ruined now." Eleanor stood in the doorway, unable to move, as the full weight of social catastrophe descended upon her. Every eye in the ballroom was upon her, reading her humiliation, cataloguing her disgrace. This was worse than simply being rejected. This was public spectacle, deliberate and cruel. Charlotte had orchestrated this, Eleanor realized. The ball, the timing, the audience, it was all designed to maximize Eleanor's shame and Charlotte's triumph. The Dowager Duchess approached Eleanor then, moving slowly with her ivory cane. When she reached Eleanor's side, she leaned close and whispered, "You have been used badly, child, and I am sorry for it. But you must leave now with whatever dignity you can muster. Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you break." Eleanor looked into the old woman's eyes and saw unexpected kindness there. She nodded once jerkily and forced herself to walk, not run, across the ballroom toward her mother. Every step felt like walking through fire, but she kept her head high, her expression blank. When she reached her mother's side, Lady Charlotte looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Eleanor," she choked out, "we are ruined, utterly ruined." Sir Richard took Eleanor's arm, his hand trembling. "Come, we must retire. There's nothing more to be done here tonight." As they walked toward the entrance, Eleanor heard Charlotte Waverley's laugh ring out behind them, bright and victorious. She heard Edmund's voice joining in, and the approving murmur of the Thornfield family who had gotten exactly what they wanted. Their heir's happiness secured, the inconvenient obstacle of Eleanor Ashford removed. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her chambers in a daze, her father and mother trailing behind her. When they reached the landing, Lady Charlotte suddenly grasped Eleanor's shoulders, her fingers digging in painfully. "How could you let this happen? How could you fail so completely? You have destroyed us, destroyed everything." "Charlotte, please," Sir Richard said weakly, pulling his wife away. "It's not Eleanor's fault." But they all knew the truth. In society's eyes, Eleanor had somehow failed to hold Edmund's interest. She had been found wanting, measured against Charlotte Waverley, and deemed inferior. The shame of it would follow them all for years to come. In her room, Eleanor dismissed Agnes with a gesture, unable to bear the pity in her maid's eyes. She stood at the window, watching as carriage after carriage departed Ashford Hall, the guests fleeing as though from a plague house. The ball was over. Her future was over. Everything was over. And downstairs, in the now empty ballroom, Eleanor could still hear faint sounds of music and laughter from the family wing, where the Thornfields were undoubtedly celebrating their victory. She had never felt so alone, so utterly humiliated, so completely and irrevocably destroyed. As the last carriage disappeared down the drive, Eleanor made a decision. She could not stay here. She could not face the pitying looks, the whispered gossip, the constant reminder of her public shame. She needed to escape, to disappear, to find somewhere, anywhere, that she could breathe without choking on humiliation. She moved to her wardrobe and began pulling out warm clothing. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. While the Thornfield family celebrated their triumph, Eleanor would vanish into the winter night, leaving behind everything and everyone who had ever known Eleanor Ashford, the girl who had dared to dream above her station. Eleanor fled Ashford Hall before dawn on Christmas Eve, leaving nothing behind but a hastily scrawled note on her dressing table. "Do not search for me. I need time alone. E." She had dressed in her warmest travelling clothes, packed a small valise with essentials, and slipped out through the servants' entrance while the house still slept. The morning was bitterly cold, with fresh snow covering the Yorkshire countryside in a thick white blanket that muffled all sound. She had no clear plan, only an overwhelming need to escape. She walked to the village through the pre-dawn darkness, her boots crunching in the snow, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At the inn, she hired a modest trap with the few coins she had saved, telling the driver she was visiting relatives in the north. He had looked at her curiously. A gentlewoman travelling alone was unusual, but her money was good, and he asked no questions. Eleanor directed him toward the high moors, toward the wild, empty spaces where she had sometimes ridden as a girl. She remembered a shepherd's hut her father had once pointed out, a stone structure used during lambing season, remote and isolated. It was there she headed, driven by instinct and desperation. By the time they reached the rutted track that led up into the hills, snow was falling heavily. The driver grew nervous. "Miss, this weather's turning bad. You certain about this?" "Yes. Leave me here. I'll walk the rest of the way. But there's naught up there but empty moorland and sheep pens." "Nevertheless, I insist. Thank you for your service." She pressed coins into his hand and set off up the track before he could protest further. She heard him call after her, but the wind swallowed his words, and soon the sound of his trap faded entirely. Eleanor climbed higher into the moors, her valise growing heavier with each step. The snow intensified, stinging her face and obscuring the landscape. She began to fear she had made a terrible mistake. The hut might not exist, or she might never find it in this blizzard. But just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she spotted it. A low stone structure built against a hillside, its door hanging slightly ajar. She stumbled inside, gasping with relief. The hut was simple but solid, with stone walls, a dirt floor, and a small fireplace. There was a rough wooden cot in one corner, covered in moth-eaten blankets that smelled of sheep and mildew. But it was shelter, and it was blessedly empty of other people. Eleanor set down her valise and immediately set about building a fire. Her hands were numb and clumsy, but eventually she coaxed a small flame to life using kindling and peat she found stacked in the corner. As warmth slowly spread through the small space, she allowed herself to collapse onto the cot, exhaustion overwhelming her. For the first time since the ball, she wept. Great, racking sobs tore through her body as the full magnitude of her situation crashed down upon her. She had been publicly humiliated, her engagement destroyed, her family's hopes crushed. The scandal would follow her forever. No respectable man would court her now. She was damaged goods, a cautionary tale whispered about in drawing rooms across England. But even as she cried, a strange thing happened. Beneath the pain and humiliation, Eleanor felt something else stirring. A dark, fierce rage. She had done nothing wrong. She had been kind, proper, obedient, everything society demanded of her. Yet she had been used and discarded like a piece of broken crockery, all so that Edmund and Charlotte could pursue their selfish desires. "They do not deserve my tears," she whispered to the empty hut. "They do not deserve my grief." She fell asleep there, wrapped in the musty blankets, her anger keeping her warmer than the meagre fire. She did not know how long she slept, hours, perhaps an entire day. When she woke, the fire had died to embers, and her body ached with cold. She tried to rise but found herself weak and dizzy. A fierce fever had taken hold, and she realized with distant alarm that she was quite ill. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of delirium. She managed to add more peat to the fire at intervals, and she drank melted snow from a tin cup she found among the shepherd's supplies. But mostly, she lay on the cot, drifting in and out of consciousness, her mind wandering through confused dreams where Charlotte Waverley's laugh echoed endlessly and Edmund's face dissolved into mist. On what she later learned was the third day after Christmas, Eleanor surfaced from fever dreams to find herself surrounded by strangers. There were voices, men's voices, urgent and concerned. Someone was wrapping her in thick wool, lifting her from the cot. She's alive, but barely. Look at her, this is quality clothing. She's gentry, no doubt. Right mess, this is. What's a lady doing up here alone? Never mind that now. Get her down to the village. Send for Dr. Crawford. Eleanor tried to speak, to tell them to leave her alone, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. She felt herself being carried, felt the bite of cold wind, and then she knew nothing more. When consciousness returned, Eleanor found herself in a warm bed in an unfamiliar room. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, and she could hear the sounds of a bustling household. Footsteps, voices, the clatter of crockery. She turned her head slowly and saw an elderly woman sitting in a chair beside the bed, knitting. The woman noticed her movement immediately. "Ah, you're awake at last. Gave us quite the fright, you did." "Where?" Eleanor's voice was hoarse and weak. "You're in Helmsley, dear, at the vicarage. The shepherd found you up in that old hut and brought you down. You've been with fever for 3 days. I'm Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar's wife." Eleanor tried to sit up, but weakness overtook her. "Easy now. Dr. Crawford says you must rest. You've had a nasty bout of pneumonia, though thankfully you're past the worst of it." Mrs. Pemberton set aside her knitting and moved to pour water from a pitcher. "Here, drink slowly." The water was cool and sweet, and Eleanor drank gratefully. As her mind cleared, panic set in. "My family, do they know where I am? We sent word to Ashford Hall that you'd been found safe. Your father came at once, but—" Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. "Well, there was quite the scene, I must say. He wanted to take you home immediately, but Dr. Crawford forbade it. Said you weren't strong enough to be moved. Your father left word that we should notify him the moment you were well enough to travel." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling trapped. She could not go back to Ashford Hall, could not face her parents' disappointment and the servants' pitying glances. But where else could she go? "Mrs. Pemberton," she said carefully, "would it be possible to send a telegram to someone else? To my aunt in the Lake District?" "Of course, dear. What's the message?" Tell her that Eleanor needs her. Please, tell her that I'm in Helmsley and ask if I might come to her." Mrs. Pemberton nodded, her eyes kind. "I'll send it this very afternoon. Now you must eat something. You're thin as a rail." Over the following days, as Eleanor slowly recovered her strength, she learned more about her rescue. The shepherd who had found her was a man named Thomas Hewitt, who used the high hut during lambing season. He had gone up to check on it after the blizzard and found Eleanor barely alive. He had carried her down on his back, walking for miles through deep snow to reach the village. "He saved my life," Eleanor murmured when Mrs. Pemberton told her the story. "That he did. Refused any reward too, said it was simple Christian duty." Eleanor found herself moved almost to tears by this stranger's kindness. Here was a simple shepherd who had risked his own safety to rescue her, a man who embodied more genuine goodness than all the aristocrats who had populated that catastrophic ball. A telegram arrived from Aunt Margaret on Eleanor's 5th day at the vicarage. Mrs. Pemberton read it aloud. "Come at once. You are always welcome here. We'll send Mr. Crawford to collect you. Love, Margaret." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. She had a refuge, a place to go where she would not be judged or pitied, but simply accepted. "Mr. Crawford is Aunt Margaret's estate manager," Eleanor explained to Mrs. Pemberton. "He's very reliable." "Then it's settled. When Dr. Crawford pronounces you fit to travel, you'll go to your aunt." That evening, as Eleanor sat up in bed for the first time, drinking broth and nibbling bread, there was a knock at the vicarage door. She heard voices in the hall, Mrs. Pemberton speaking with someone whose voice was unfamiliar, deep and cultured, with a slight Scottish lilt. A moment later, Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway. "Miss Ashford, there's a gentleman here to see you. A Dr. Alexander Crawford." Eleanor's heart skipped. Crawford was her aunt's estate manager, but she had never met him. He had only been in Aunt Margaret's employment for 6 months, but he wasn't supposed to arrive until tomorrow at the earliest. Nevertheless, here he is. "Shall I send him in?" Eleanor quickly touched her hair, conscious that she must look a fright in her borrowed nightgown, her dark hair loose and uncombed. Yes, of course." The man who entered was not what Eleanor had expected. She had pictured someone middle-aged and formal, but Dr. Alexander Crawford was perhaps 30, tall and lean, with dark brown hair and intelligent grey-green eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a simple but well-cut travelling suit and carried a leather medical bag. "Miss Ashford, I'm relieved to find you recovering. Your aunt has been frantic with worry." His voice held genuine concern, and when he smiled, his entire face transformed from serious to warm. "I came as quickly as I could." "You're very kind, Dr. Crawford, but I understood you managed my aunt's estate. Are you also a physician?" "I hold medical credentials from Edinburgh, but I practice primarily estate medicine, caring for tenants and staff. Your aunt employed me specifically because of that dual capacity. When your telegram arrived, she thought it best to send someone who could both transport you safely and attend to your health during the journey. That was thoughtful of her." "May I examine you to ensure you're fit for travel, with Mrs. Pemberton present, of course?" Eleanor agreed, and Dr. Crawford conducted a brief but thorough examination, checking her breathing, her pulse, her fever. His manner was professional and respectful, his touch impersonal. "The local doctor has done excellent work," he pronounced. "You're on the mend, but I'd prefer to wait 2 more days before attempting the journey north. We'll travel slowly, with frequent stops. Your aunt has arranged accommodations along the route. I cannot thank you enough for coming all this way. It's no trouble. Your aunt speaks of you often and with great affection. She was most distressed to learn of your recent difficulties." Eleanor's eyes dropped. So he knew about the scandal. Of course he did. It would be all over England by now, repeated gleefully in every newspaper and drawing room. "I see you've heard," she said quietly. "Only what your aunt chose to share, which was minimal. She simply said you had been treated abominably by people who should have known better, and that you needed sanctuary. The specifics are, frankly, none of my concern." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by his discretion. "That's generous of you." "Not at all. I'm a firm believer that how a person responds to adversity reveals their true character, not the adversity itself. You've clearly shown courage and strength in difficult circumstances. That speaks well of you, Miss Ashford." It was the first kind word anyone had spoken to her since the disaster. The first acknowledgement that she was not somehow to blame for her own humiliation. To Eleanor's mortification, tears welled in her eyes. Dr. Crawford pretended not to notice, busying himself with repacking his medical bag. "I'll take rooms at the inn and return tomorrow to check on your progress. In the meantime, rest and eat well. The Lake District awaits, and I promise you, Miss Ashford, it is one of the most beautiful and healing places in all of England. You'll find peace there, I think." After he left, Eleanor lay back against her pillows, her mind whirling. There was something about Dr. Alexander Crawford that intrigued her. A calm competence, an absence of judgment, an intelligence that seemed to look beyond surfaces. And when he had smiled at her, she had felt the strangest flutter in her chest, something she had never experienced in all her months of courting Edmund Thornfield. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself. "You've just escaped one disaster. Don't go creating another." But as she drifted off to sleep that night, It was Dr. Crawford's kind grey-green eyes that accompanied her into dreams, not Edmund's cold blue ones. True to his word, Dr. Crawford returned the next day and the day after, checking Eleanor's progress with professional thoroughness. On the third day, he pronounced her fit to travel, and preparations began for their departure. Eleanor wrote letters to her parents, assuring them of her safety and informing them she would be staying with Aunt Margaret indefinitely. She thanked the Pembertons profusely for their hospitality and insisted on leaving them a monetary gift despite their protests. She also asked Mrs. Pemberton to convey her thanks to Thomas Hewitt the shepherd, and to give him a sum that Mrs. Pemberton assured her was more than generous. On a cold January morning, Eleanor climbed into the comfortable carriage Aunt Margaret had sent, wrapped in warm blankets and fur-lined travelling cloaks. Dr. Crawford took the seat opposite her, and Mrs. Pemberton waved goodbye from the vicarage doorstep. As they rolled north toward the Lake District, leaving Yorkshire behind, Eleanor felt as though she were shedding an old skin. The girl who had stood in that ballroom, broken and humiliated, was disappearing with each mile they travelled. Someone new was emerging, someone stronger, angrier, more determined to forge her own path. Dr. Crawford proved to be an excellent travelling companion. He was well-read and could discuss literature, philosophy and current events with intelligence and nuance. He asked Eleanor's opinions on various topics and actually listened to her answers, engaging in genuine debate rather than dismissing her views. It was exhilarating to converse with someone who valued her mind. "You have quite progressive views on education reform," he observed as they stopped at an inn for luncheon. "That's unusual for someone of your background." "Is it a fault?" Eleanor asked, half challenging. "Not at all. It's refreshing. Too many people simply parrot whatever opinions they've been taught without examining them critically. You think for yourself. That's admirable." Eleanor felt herself warming to him, despite her determination to remain emotionally distant. "And you, Dr. Crawford? What brought you from Edinburgh medicine to estate management in the Lake District?" A shadow crossed his face. "My own scandal, I suppose. I advocated too loudly for improving conditions in the city's poorhouses and offended several wealthy patrons of the hospital where I worked. When it became clear my career prospects were limited, your aunt offered me a position that would allow me to practice medicine among people who actually needed it, rather than pampered society ladies with imaginary ailments." "So we're both refugees from polite society," Eleanor said with a wry smile. "It would seem so. Perhaps that's why we understand each other." Their eyes met across the table, and Eleanor felt that flutter again, stronger this time. She looked away quickly, unsettled by the sensation. They reached Aunt Margaret's estate, Willowmere, 3 days later. The house was a gracious Georgian manor overlooking Windermere Lake, its grounds sweeping down to the water's edge. Aunt Margaret herself stood waiting on the front steps, a tall, slender woman in her 50s, with Eleanor's grey eyes and an air of serene self-possession. "Eleanor, my dear girl," she said, embracing her niece warmly. "Welcome home." And standing there in her aunt's arms, with the cold wind off the lake whipping her hair and Dr. Alexander Crawford carrying her valise up the steps behind her, Eleanor realized something astonishing. She felt hopeful for the first time in weeks. Perhaps her life was not over after all. Perhaps it was only just beginning. Winter gradually surrendered to spring at Willowmere, and Eleanor flourished in ways she had never imagined possible. Aunt Margaret proved to be a revelation, a woman of fierce intelligence and independence who had chosen widowhood over remarriage precisely because it afforded her freedoms no wife could enjoy. She managed her late husband's estate with shrewd capability, invested in progressive causes, and maintained a salon of artists, writers, and intellectuals who gathered monthly to discuss everything from suffrage to scientific advancement. "You've been taught to make yourself small," Aunt Margaret said one morning as they walked along the lake shore. "To dim your light so that men might shine brighter. But intelligence is not a flaw to be hidden, Eleanor. It's a gift to be cultivated." Under her aunt's guidance, Eleanor began to read voraciously, philosophy, politics, social theory. She attended lectures at the local Mechanics Institute, where Dr. Crawford often spoke on public health and medical reform. She discovered that her opinions mattered, that her mind was sharp and capable of complex thought, that she had been starving intellectually for years without even realizing it. And through it all, Dr. Alexander Crawford was a steady presence. He dined at Willowmere twice weekly, accompanied Eleanor and her aunt on outings, and gradually became Eleanor's closest friend. They walked together along the fells, discussing books and ideas with passionate intensity. He challenged her thinking without condescension, admired her insights without patronizing flattery. "You would have made an excellent physician," he told her one April afternoon as they examined wildflowers growing beside a stream. "Your mind is precise and analytical." "Only women cannot study medicine," Eleanor replied, though his praise warmed her. "Not yet, but society changes, Miss Ashford. Sometimes slowly, frustratingly slowly, but it does change. Perhaps in your lifetime, women will have access to all professions." "Do you truly believe that?" "I do. And I believe women like you, intelligent, educated, determined, will help make it possible." Eleanor realized with startling clarity that she was falling in love with Alexander Crawford. It was nothing like her courtship with Edmund had been. This was a meeting of minds and souls, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. When Alexander smiled at her, her heart raced. When his hand accidentally brushed hers during their walks, electricity seemed to spark between them. And sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. But Alexander never spoke of love, never indicated his feelings went beyond friendship. Eleanor told herself it was better this way. She was in no position to marry, damaged as she was by scandal. Yet she could not quite suppress the hope that perhaps, someday, he might care for her as she cared for him. In late May, Aunt Margaret announced her intention to host a garden party to benefit a local charity supporting education for working-class children. "It will be quite a large affair," she said over breakfast. "I've invited progressive thinkers from across the north of England. There will be artists, writers, reformers, the sort of people who make society nervous." She smiled at Eleanor. "And I want you to help me organize it. It's time you stepped back into society, my dear, on your own terms." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. "I'm not certain I'm ready for society." "Not that society," Aunt Margaret said firmly. "Not the shallow, cruel world that treated you so badly. But there's another England, Eleanor. One full of people working to build something better. Artists who create beauty, scientists who expand human knowledge, reformers who fight for justice. Those are the people worth knowing, and they'll judge you by your character and contributions, not by outdated scandal." Eleanor agreed and threw herself into the preparations. She corresponded with speakers, arranged accommodations, planned menus, and organized the garden to accommodate over 200 guests. Alexander was deeply involved as well, as the benefit was for a cause close to his heart. They spent hours together planning, and Eleanor felt more alive than she ever had. The night before the garden party, as Eleanor supervised final arrangements, Alexander found her among the rose arbors. "Miss Ashford, Eleanor, I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course." Eleanor set down her list of seating arrangements, her heart beginning to race. Something in Alexander's tone suggested this was no ordinary conversation. He seemed uncharacteristically nervous, adjusting his spectacles and running a hand through his hair. "I've been meaning to speak with you for some time, but the opportunity never seemed right. Now, with tomorrow's party and all the guests arriving, I fear I may lose my courage if I wait longer." "What is it, Alexander?" "Eleanor, these past months have been the happiest of my life. Your intelligence, your kindness, your courage in facing adversity, you've captivated me completely. I know your situation is complicated, that scandal still attaches to your name in certain circles. I know I'm merely an estate manager without title or fortune, but I must tell you what's in my heart. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you almost from the moment we met." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "Alexander, please let me finish. I'm asking if you might consider, someday when you're ready, allowing me to court you properly, with a view toward marriage, if you could ever care for me as I care for you. I promise I will wait as long as you need. I ask only for hope that you might someday return my feelings." "Return them?" Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Oh, Alexander, I've been in love with you for months. I never dared hope you might feel the same." The joy that transformed his face was beautiful to behold. He took her hands in his, and for a moment they simply stood there, gazing at each other with wonder. "Then I may court you, properly, with your aunt's blessing?" "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He raised her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I cannot offer you wealth or position, Eleanor, but I can promise you respect, partnership and love for as long as I live. Those are the only things I want," Eleanor whispered. They were still standing hand in hand when Aunt Margaret found them, and from her satisfied smile it was clear she had expected, perhaps even orchestrated, this outcome all along. The garden party the next day was a resounding success. Over 200 guests wandered through Willowmere's grounds, attending lectures, viewing art exhibitions, and discussing ideas with passionate enthusiasm. Eleanor, wearing a gown of soft blue that made her grey eyes luminous, moved through the crowd with confidence she had never known she possessed. This was her world now, not the shallow glitter of London ballrooms, but the vibrant intellectual community her aunt had cultivated. She was deep in conversation with a prominent suffragist when a commotion near the garden entrance drew her attention. A new party of guests had arrived, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see they were different from the other attendees, more formally dressed, more rigidly proper. Her heart sank when she recognized the leader of the group, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Lord Edmund's grandmother, the same woman who had shown her unexpected kindness the night of the disaster. Aunt Margaret hurried over to Eleanor's side. "I invited her," she said quietly. "The Dowager is a generous supporter of educational charities. I hoped she might attend, but I wasn't certain she would." The Dowager approached them, her bearing as regal as ever despite her advanced years. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for the invitation. Your garden party is quite unlike anything I've attended in years, refreshingly so. Your Grace, you honour us with your presence," Aunt Margaret said, curtsying. "I believe you know my niece, Miss Eleanor Ashford." "Indeed I do." The Dowager's keen eyes studied Eleanor. "Miss Ashford, you look remarkably well. The Lake District clearly agrees with you." "Thank you, Your Grace, it does. I had hoped we might speak privately, if you would grant me a few moments." Eleanor glanced at her aunt, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Your Grace." They walked together to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the crowds. When they were alone, the Dowager's formal manner softened slightly. "I came here today partly for the charity, which is worthy, but also to see you," she began. "I owe you an apology, Miss Ashford. My family treated you abominably, and I did nothing to prevent it. That weighs on my conscience." Eleanor was too surprised to respond immediately. "I want you to know the truth of what happened," the Dowager continued. "Charlotte Waverley had been pursuing Edmund for years, despite my son's disapproval of a marriage between cousins. When Edmund was finally pressured to seek a bride, Charlotte became desperate. She convinced Edmund that his only hope of happiness lay in defying his father and marrying her instead. I see. What you may not know is that Charlotte deliberately orchestrated the timing of the announcement at your ball. She wanted to humiliate you as publicly as possible, to ensure no suspicion would attach to her, that she would appear as Edmund's true love rather than a manipulative schemer. Eleanor felt old anger stir, but found it had lost much of its power. "And Lord Edmund went along with this?" "Edmund is weak, I'm afraid, easily led by stronger personalities. Charlotte has always been able to bend him to her will." The Dowager sighed. "They married in Scotland and returned to face my son's wrath. He refused to receive them for 3 months, until family pressure became unbearable. "Are they happy?" Eleanor asked, surprised to find she genuinely wanted to know. "No." Charlotte discovered that capturing Edmund and keeping him satisfied are two different things. He drinks too much and spends his days gambling in London, avoiding his wife. She, meanwhile, finds that being married to a duke's heir is not as glamorous as she imagined when the heir in question is a disappointing bore. They've made each other quite miserable, actually. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of sympathy and vindication. "I'm sorry to hear it." "Are you? You're more generous than I would be in your position." The dowager studied her intently. "I came today for another reason as well. I wanted to tell you that society's memory is short, Miss Ashford. Already new scandals have eclipsed yours. In a year, perhaps less, the whole affair will be largely forgotten. You could return to society if you chose. My influence could help reopen doors." Eleanor considered this offer carefully. 6 months ago, she would have leaped at it, anything to escape the shame and disgrace. But now, standing in her aunt's beautiful garden, surrounded by people who valued her mind and character, the thought of returning to that shallow, judgmental world held no appeal whatsoever. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your kindness means more than I can say. But I find I have no desire to return to that life. I've discovered I'm happier here, among people who see me as more than a marriageable commodity." The dowager smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her aristocratic features. "I thought you might say that. Good for you, my dear. You found something rare, the courage to choose your own path. I admire that immensely." As they walked back toward the party, Eleanor felt a profound sense of closure. The past no longer had power over her. She was free. She found Alexander near the lake, speaking with a group of physicians about rural health initiatives. When he saw her, his face lit up, and he excused himself to join her. "How did your conversation with the dowager go?" "Better than I expected. She came to apologize and to offer help reintegrating into society." "And will you accept?" "No. I've found where I belong, Alexander, right here." He took her hand, no longer caring who might see. "I'm very glad to hear it, because I have something I wish to ask your aunt this evening, and I'd prefer you be nearby when I do." Eleanor's heart soared. She knew exactly what he intended to ask, permission to marry her, and she knew exactly what her answer would be. As the sun set over Windermere Lake, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Eleanor stood with Alexander and watched the guests depart. The garden party had been a triumph, raising substantial funds for the education charity and introducing Eleanor to a community where she truly belonged. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" Alexander asked quietly. "Happier than I knew was possible," she answered truthfully. "Then I consider myself the most fortunate man in England." They stood hand in hand as darkness fell, two people who had found each other through adversity and chosen love over convention. Eleanor thought briefly of the girl she had been, desperate for approval, willing to sacrifice herself for family duty. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than genuine love and respect. The future stretched before her, full of possibility and promise, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Ashford felt truly, completely free. Alexander proposed formally to Eleanor 3 days after the garden party in Aunt Margaret's drawing room with her aunt serving as witness. He had no ring yet, no grand romantic gesture, but his words were heartfelt and sincere. "Eleanor Ashford, I'm asking you to be my wife. I offer you a modest home, a life dedicated to helping others, and a partnership built on equality and love. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." Aunt Margaret embraced them both, her eyes bright with happy tears. "I've been hoping for this since the day Alexander arrived with you. I've never seen two people better suited." They decided to marry in early autumn, after the harvest was complete and Alexander's duties on the estate were less pressing. The engagement was announced locally, but not published in the London papers. Neither Alexander nor Eleanor had any desire to invite society's scrutiny. This was their happiness, private and precious. Eleanor wrote to her parents, informing them of her engagement. Her father's response came quickly, expressing relief that she had recovered from the unfortunate Thornfield affair and found a respectable match. Her mother's letter was more conflicted, alternating between happiness at Eleanor's obvious contentment and disappointment that she was marrying merely an estate manager instead of a peer. But Eleanor found she no longer cared about her mother's approval. She was building a life based on her own values, not society's arbitrary standards. News of the engagement did reach broader society, however, carried by guests who had attended Aunt Margaret's garden party. The reaction was mixed. Some dismissed it as expected, a disgraced young woman settling for whatever man would have her. Others, particularly in progressive circles, celebrated it as a love match between two intelligent, principled people. And inevitably, word reached the Thornfield family. One afternoon in early July, as Eleanor worked in Aunt Margaret's conservatory tending to orchids, a servant announced an unexpected visitor, Miss Charlotte Waverley Thornfield. Eleanor's hands stilled on the watering can. Charlotte had travelled all the way from Yorkshire to the Lake District. For what possible reason? "Show her in," Aunt Margaret said calmly, having joined Eleanor when the visitor was announced. "Let's see what she wants." Charlotte swept into the conservatory moments later, dressed in the height of London fashion, a lavender walking dress with elaborate trim and a matching hat decorated with ostrich feathers. She looked beautiful and expensive, but Eleanor noted dark circles beneath her eyes that cosmetics could not quite conceal. "Miss Ashford," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false warmth, "how charming to see you looking so healthy. Country life must agree with you." "Mrs. Thornfield," Eleanor replied coolly, "this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is, but when I heard about your engagement, I felt I simply must come and offer my congratulations in person." Charlotte's smile was sharp as a knife. "An estate manager. How wonderfully practical of you." Aunt Margaret stepped forward. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Mrs. Margaret Blackwood, Eleanor's aunt." "Of course, forgive me." Charlotte executed a brief curtsy that somehow managed to seem insulting rather than respectful. "I'm sure you're delighted to have your niece settled, even if the match is somewhat humble." "I'm delighted that my niece is marrying a man of intelligence, integrity, and genuine worth," Aunt Margaret replied with steel in her voice, "qualities more valuable than any title." Charlotte's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly beneath. Jealousy, Eleanor realized with surprise. Charlotte was jealous of her. "How lovely that you've convinced yourself of that," Charlotte said, turning back to Eleanor. "I wanted to assure you that Edmund and I bear you no ill will. We're very happy in our marriage, of course. Edmund's father has finally accepted our union, and we're quite the celebrated couple in London society." It was such an obvious lie that Eleanor almost laughed. If they were truly happy and celebrated, Charlotte would not have travelled all this way to say so. Happy people did not seek out those they had wronged to boast about their contentment. "I'm glad to hear it," Eleanor said neutrally. "Are you? Truly?" Charlotte stepped closer, her eyes glittering. "Because I wondered if perhaps you harboured resentment toward me. After all, I did steal your fiancé." "Edmund was never truly mine to steal," Eleanor said, discovering as she spoke that she meant it. "And I've come to realize you did me an enormous favor. If you hadn't revealed his true character before the wedding, I might have spent years trapped in a loveless marriage with a weak, shallow man. You saved me from that fate. So truly, Mrs. Thornfield. Thank you." Charlotte's face flushed with anger. "How dare you call Edmund weak and shallow? Is he not? You said yourself that you've loved him since childhood. You know his character better than anyone. Would you truly describe him as strong and deep?" Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "I thought not," Eleanor said gently. We both know what Edmund is, Mrs. Thornfield. The difference is that I've escaped that knowledge, while you must live with it every day. I love him, Charlotte said, but her voice had lost its confidence. Perhaps you do. But love alone cannot sustain a marriage when there is no respect, no shared values, no intellectual companionship. I hope, for both your sakes, that you find some contentment together. But your happiness or unhappiness is no longer any concern of mine. Charlotte stared at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw the precise instant when her former rival realized she had lost. Not the battle for Edmund. Charlotte had won that months ago. But the larger contest, the one that truly mattered, the contest for a life well lived. I should go, Charlotte said stiffly. I have a long journey back to Yorkshire. Safe travels, Mrs. Thornfield, Eleanor said, and meant it. After Charlotte left, Aunt Margaret embraced Eleanor warmly. I'm proud of you, my dear. You handled that with remarkable grace. I felt sorry for her, actually, Eleanor confessed. She fought so hard for something that's made her miserable. The tragedy of getting what we think we want, only to discover we wanted the wrong thing entirely. Eleanor thought about this as she returned to her orchids. She had once believed that marrying someone like Edmund, wealthy, titled, socially prominent, was the pinnacle of feminine achievement, but she had been so desperately wrong. True happiness lay not in social position, but in genuine connection, shared purpose, and the freedom to be one's authentic self. The summer passed in a blur of wedding preparations, though Eleanor insisted on a simple ceremony. She wanted no grand ball, no elaborate display. Instead, they would marry in the small church in the village, with a modest celebration afterward at Willowmere for family and close friends. Eleanor designed her own wedding gown, working with a local dressmaker to create something beautiful but practical, ivory silk with simple lines and minimal ornamentation. She would wear flowers in her hair instead of jewels and carry wildflowers from the fells instead of hothouse roses. It's perfect, Alexander said when she described her vision, just like you. They spent their engagement in constant companionship, walking the fells, reading together in Aunt Margaret's library, planning their future. Alexander had saved enough money to purchase a small cottage near Windermere, where he would continue his medical work while also practicing general medicine for the local community. Eleanor would have a study of her own, where she could read and write, and perhaps someday pursue charitable work, helping other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. I want to help young women who feel trapped by society's expectations, she told Alexander one evening as they sat by the lake. Women like I was, who don't realize they have choices until it's almost too late. You'll be wonderful at it, he assured her. You have empathy born of experience and the intelligence to channel it productively. In late August, Eleanor received an unexpected letter from the Dowager Duchess. It contained a wedding gift, a substantial check, and a note that read, "For your new life, may you always have the courage to choose your own path. With admiration, Amelia Thornfield." Eleanor was deeply moved. She used part of the money to establish a small fund for educating village girls, administered by Aunt Margaret. The rest she set aside for the cottage, to ensure she and Alexander would have a comfortable start to their married life. The week before the wedding, Eleanor's parents arrived at Willowmere. The reunion was awkward at first. Lady Charlotte could barely conceal her disappointment at the modest scale of the wedding, while Sir Richard seemed genuinely pleased to see his daughter happy. But on Eleanor's final evening as an unmarried woman, her father sought her out in the garden. "Eleanor, I owe you an apology," he said heavily. "I pushed you toward the Thornfield match because I was desperate to solve our financial problems. I never asked what you wanted, never considered that you might wish to choose your own husband. I failed you as a father." Eleanor took his hand, surprised by his words. "Papa, you did what you thought was best. Society gave you no other models to follow. Perhaps. But I've watched you these past few days with Dr. Crawford. And I've never seen you so radiant. This is what a marriage should look like. Partnership, respect, genuine affection. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the freedom to find it sooner. I found it anyway, Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. And perhaps I needed to lose my way first, to truly appreciate the right path when I found it. You're wiser than I'll ever be, her father said with a sad smile. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. Truly proud. They stood together in the gathering dusk, and Eleanor felt another piece of her past settle into place. She could not change what had happened, but she could choose how it shaped her, and she chose to let it make her stronger, kinder, more certain of her own worth. On the morning of her wedding, Eleanor woke at dawn and walked down to the lake one final time as Miss Ashford. The September morning was cool and misty, the water reflecting the pale sky like a mirror. She thought of the girl who had fled into a Yorkshire blizzard 9 months ago, broken and desperate. That girl had been destroyed, yes, but from her ashes, this new Eleanor had risen, tempered by adversity into someone far stronger and more certain than she had ever been. "Thank you," she whispered to her past self. "Thank you for being brave enough to leave. Thank you for surviving." Then she turned back toward Willowmere, where Agnes was waiting to help her dress, where her family and friends would soon gather, where Alexander would be waiting to pledge his love and loyalty before God and witnesses. As Eleanor walked up the sloping lawn toward her new life, the morning sun broke through the mist, painting everything golden. It felt like a benediction, a promise that her courage had been rewarded, her faith in love vindicated. By midday, she would be Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, beginning a life built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. And she had never been more certain that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to love. 18 months after her wedding, Eleanor Crawford stood at the window of her cottage overlooking Windermere Lake, watching April rain sweep across the water in silver sheets. The cottage was small, but perfectly suited to their needs. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a cozy sitting room with a fireplace, Alexander's study for his medical books and correspondence, and Eleanor's own study where she conducted her work with the Women's Education Society she had founded. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt both purposeful and joyful. Alexander's medical practice had grown steadily, and he was beloved among the local community for his skill and compassion. Eleanor had thrown herself into advocacy work, helping young women access education and employment opportunities beyond domestic service. She also wrote articles for progressive magazines under her own name, arguing for women's rights and social reform with a clarity born of personal experience. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. More importantly, they were happy in ways Eleanor had never imagined possible during her years of striving for social advancement. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Crawford, there's a young woman here asking for you. Says she needs help urgently. Show her in, please." The young woman who entered was perhaps 19, plainly but respectably dressed with reddened eyes and trembling hands. Eleanor recognized the signs immediately. Another young woman in distress, seeking the refuge Eleanor's charity had become known for providing. "Please sit down," Eleanor said gently, guiding her to a chair by the fire. "Tell me what's troubling you." "My name is Sarah Whitfield, ma'am. I'm governess to a family in Keswick, but the master has been inappropriate. I complained to his wife, but she dismissed me without a character reference. I can't get another position without references, but I can't go back there either. I don't know what to do." Eleanor's heart ached with recognition. How many women found themselves in exactly such impossible situations, trapped by economic necessity and society's indifference to their suffering? "You've come to the right place, Miss Whitfield. First, we'll arrange temporary accommodation for you with a family I know. Then we'll work on securing your references. I have contacts who can help. And finally, we'll find you a position with a reputable family. You're not alone in this." The girl's tears of relief and gratitude reminded Eleanor why she did this work. Every woman she helped felt like a small victory against the injustice she had once experienced herself. After Sarah left, Eleanor sat down to respond to her correspondence. Among the letters was one that made her pause, an invitation to speak at a women's rights conference in Manchester. The organizers had read her articles and wanted her to address the assembly on the topic of women's economic independence. "They want me to speak to 300 people," Eleanor murmured, both thrilled and terrified. "You'll be magnificent," Alexander said, entering the room and reading over her shoulder. "You have important things to say, and you say them well. But 300 people, Alexander. What if I stumble? What if they don't take me seriously? Then you'll recover, and they'll be fools." He kissed the top of her head. "You're one of the most articulate advocates I know. Trust yourself." Eleanor accepted the invitation and spent the following weeks preparing her remarks. She would speak from experience, she decided, tell her own story as an illustration of how society's marriage market damaged women, then propose concrete reforms to give women greater economic freedom and legal rights. The conference took place in early June. Eleanor travelled to Manchester with Alexander and Aunt Margaret, who insisted on attending to show support. Standing backstage before her speech, Eleanor felt her old fears resurface. What if society still judged her as the scandalous Miss Ashford who had been publicly jilted? What if her past undermined her credibility? But when she stepped onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces, women of all ages and stations, eager to hear what she had to say, Eleanor felt her confidence return. These were her people. This was her purpose. "I stand before you today as living proof that our current system fails women," she began, her voice clear and strong. 18 months ago, I was publicly humiliated when my engagement was broken spectacularly at what was meant to be our announcement ball. Society taught me that my value lay in making an advantageous marriage, that my intelligence and capabilities were irrelevant compared to my ability to please a man. She spoke for 40 minutes. Her words met with rapt attention and, when she finished, thunderous applause. Women approached her afterward, sharing their own stories, thanking her for her courage. But the most unexpected response came from a woman who had been sitting in the back row. When Eleanor finally saw her face, she nearly gasped in recognition. It was the Dowager Duchess of Ashford. "Your Grace, I had no idea you attended such events." "I don't, usually," the Dowager admitted. "But I read that you would be speaking and I was curious. You've become quite the advocate, Mrs. Crawford." "I'm impressed. Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." "I wanted you to know something," the Dowager said, lowering her voice. "Edmund and Charlotte's marriage has fallen apart completely. They live separately now. He in London, she at the family's Scottish estate. My son is discussing the possibility of a private separation, perhaps even an eventual divorce, though the scandal would be immense." Eleanor felt a complicated mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also genuine sadness. "I'm sorry to hear it." "Are you? I thought you might feel some satisfaction, given how they treated you." "Perhaps I would have once, but I've learned that taking pleasure in others' misery diminishes us. I hope they both find some measure of peace, whether together or apart." The Dowager studied her with those keen grey eyes. "You've become a remarkable woman, Mrs. Crawford. The Thornfields' loss was the world's gain. Your work matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." After the conference, Eleanor's profile grew. She was invited to write for more prominent publications, to speak at other gatherings, to serve on committees addressing women's issues. She and Alexander became fixtures in progressive circles, hosting salons at their cottage where local thinkers gathered to debate reform ideas. One evening the following autumn, as Eleanor prepared for one such salon, she reflected on how far she had come. The terrified girl who had fled into a snowstorm seemed like someone from another lifetime. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth, who had found her voice and her purpose, who woke each morning eager to face the challenges of the day. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked, the same question he had posed so many times before. "Deliriously so," Eleanor answered, kissing him. I have meaningful work, a partner who respects me completely, and a life filled with purpose. What more could anyone want? Nothing, he agreed. Absolutely nothing. That evening's salon was particularly lively, with passionate debates about education reform and women's suffrage. Eleanor participated fully, arguing her positions with the confidence that came from knowing she had earned her place at the table through intelligence and hard work, not family connections or social standing. As the guests departed, and she and Alexander cleaned up, Eleanor found herself at the window again, gazing out at Windermere Lake, bathed in moonlight. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if Edmund hadn't rejected you?" Alexander asked, coming to stand beside her. "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "I imagine a version of myself trapped in a loveless marriage, my mind slowly withering from disuse, my spirit crushed by the constant need to be less than I am. It's a chilling thought. Then we owe him a debt of gratitude in a way. His cruelty freed you to become who you were always meant to be." Eleanor considered this. Perhaps I would have found my strength eventually, even within that marriage. We'll never know. But I'm grateful for the path I walked, painful as it was, because it led me here. To you, to this work, to this life. She turned to face him fully. "I used to think that being rejected at that ball was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. Now I see it was the best. It shattered all my false beliefs about what mattered: status, wealth, society's approval. And from those shattered pieces, I built something real and lasting." "You built yourself," Alexander said softly. "You took your pain and transformed it into purpose. That's no small thing, Eleanor." "We built ourselves," she corrected. "Together. You showed me what true partnership looks like, what respect and equality and love really mean. I couldn't have done any of this without you." "That's not true, but I appreciate the sentiment." "It is true. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. You saw potential I couldn't see. You gave me the safety to become who I was meant to be." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight dance across the water. Eleanor thought about all the women she had helped, all the articles she had written, all the minds she had changed with her advocacy. Her life had purpose and meaning beyond anything she had imagined in her days of striving for social position. And perhaps most importantly, she had found love, real, genuine love, built on mutual respect and shared values. Not the hollow performance of affection that characterized her courtship with Edmund, but something deep and sustaining that grew stronger with each passing day. "I received a letter today from Sarah Whitfield," Eleanor said, remembering. "The young governess we helped last year. She's found a wonderful position with a family in Edinburgh, and she's saving money to attend Teachers' College. She said our intervention changed her life." "Your intervention," Alexander corrected gently. "Our intervention. This is partnership work. You supported me in starting the charity. You provide medical care to the women we help. You lend credibility to our cause. We do this together." Alexander smiled, that warm smile that still made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. Together then. Always together. As they prepared for bed that night, Eleanor paused at her writing desk, where a half-finished article awaited her attention. The title read, "On Choosing Our Own Destinies, a Personal Reflection." She would finish it tomorrow, she decided. Tonight, she wanted simply to appreciate the moment, to feel grateful for the journey that had brought her from despair to fulfillment, from crushing rejection to profound happiness. She climbed into bed beside Alexander, settling into the familiar comfort of his arms. Outside, autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and earth. The cottage creaked softly, a sound Eleanor had come to love. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Alexander murmured, already half asleep. "For seeing me, for choosing me, for building this life with me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "For being brave enough to start over, for not letting them break you." Eleanor smiled in the darkness. They hadn't broken her. They had merely broken her illusions, and in doing so, They had set her free. She fell asleep that night thinking not of grand balls and glittering society, not of titles and position and social standing, but of Sarah Whitfield learning to teach, of the next salon they would host, of the article she would finish tomorrow, of the life she and Alexander were building together, one purposeful day at a time. This was happiness, not the shallow glitter she had once coveted, but something deep and real and earned. This was freedom, not the empty freedom to do nothing, but the precious freedom to become everything she was capable of being. This was love, genuine, equal, sustaining love that made her stronger rather than diminishing her. And as Eleanor drifted into peaceful sleep in her small cottage overlooking Windermere Lake, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not trade this life for all the duchies in England. She had bloomed where she was planted, and the garden she had cultivated was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined in her days of confinement in society's golden cage. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments from which part of the world you're listening. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Your support helps me continue bringing these stories to life.